So how can we, or for myself, for example, how can I be an advocate for changes in the way that the BZA and that whole kind of part of the city operates, outside of the mayor? I mean, I don't really feel like I personally have a say in who goes on that board. So ultimately, my voice is pretty small for that change, right? So if we do want to see the city look down, sit down and be smart about it, I mean, realistically, what can I do?
Well, I mean, change is slow, and I will admit to that. And I will say that, even as someone who spends a lot of time with the administration and council, change is painfully slow. In terms of some of the appointments, whether it's the BZA or the Planning Commission, I mean, there I think you have every right to talk to your council member and indicate the type of open minds, the type of folks you'd like to see, or the characteristics of folks you'd like to see serving on planning. And I think we just have to keep reiterating to the mayor and his administration that, I mean, the home builders do a very good job of, quite frankly, beating on the administration about room 110, permits and inspection, constantly talking about permits and inspection. And I think you just have to keep beating the drum. And for us, what the drum that we've been beating is planning has to move more quickly. And, it's taken how long to get the, Richmond 300 to where it is today. And then after Richmond 300, we're going to have gobs of, zoning code changes that have to be walked through. And what I would say is that, if you have an opportunity to speak to the mayor or his chief of staff or Sharon Ebert, who's the deputy over planning, is to say, look, this city will be developed by SUP before you guys ever get around to your overlays and your rezonings. And, Dwight Jones used to want to say when he was mayor, we're going to, what did he say? We're going to develop deliberately, and I don't know. He had some phrase for it, which was completely contradictory to how his planning department ran, which is, again, think of all the development, think of all the units that have been put on the ground since the master plan process started, right? Where they've gone, how Manchester and Scott's Addition have been developed. And at some point you got to say, look, are you guys going to be the locomotive or the caboose? Come on. So I know that's not particularly helpful to say you just got to get in people's ear and constantly stay in people's ear. But I think that's our experience.
So, Rick, before you jump in, one quick follow-up to that, Laura? So, thank you again for your answers and thoughts. So as realtors, we know the city so well, and although there are some very smart people that work for the city, we're also can be pretty smart too. Is there a reason that RER couldn't be part of that more specific request for change to say, here are some neighborhoods where we support duplexes by right? We want the planning department to move more quickly. Let's, instead of just kind of encouraging them to be thinking about it, is there a reason that we as an organization can't be helping them with that, making a more specific plan or neighborhood list? Or, obviously there's housing discrimination and it could be very murky water, but is that something that RER could be involved in? And do you think that would be beneficial? Okay.
Yeah, I would welcome, I would welcome your thoughts on that, and I'm happy to have a conversation about that. We, when we started working on Airbnb, we brought together an ad hoc group of realtors because we knew we're gonna, not make anybody happy pretty much, but we still wanted to hear from folks. And that is typically how we work with the city. We don't sit back and wait for the city. We have given the city a model or what we think are the important elements of an accessory dwelling unit ordinance. And what I was told, this was like 2 years ago, well, we have to get the short-term rental thing before we can do accessory dwelling. So here we are 2 years later. We have been working on an abatement and rebate program to spur affordable multifamily development for 2 years. 2 years. So it's not at all unusual for us to give them draft ordinances, and it just takes an extraordinary long time to negotiate those ordinances with council, to make sure everybody realizes it's their idea, not our idea, if you know what I mean. But I've made a note about this issue of duplexes and triplexes by right, and I would love to continue that conversation.
Thank you, Laura. I'd love to speak to you more about that.
All right, I got you down.
Thanks.
Laura,
Yes.
I think in light of all the backdrop with, the protests that have gone on and everything, I think everyone has kind of had this sort of, awakening, if you will, or, all of a sudden what, we've seen a million times, all of a sudden we now finally see in a lot more clarity. And so I think it's like we take a snapshot of where we are right now and we see these problems. Going back, call it 10 years or even 15 years, I've seen a tremendous amount of betterment throughout many of the communities in the city. I've seen an evolution of, obviously there's still a lot of problems, but it felt like heading into this, the trend was not a bad one. Obviously it could move faster, and there's a lot of reasons why it may or may not have moved more quickly. But from your perspective, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, if things are really progressing right now, I think that also needs to be said. I mean, this is these are hundreds of years old problems, really. And, to all of a sudden say, oh my gosh, we should stop what we're doing and do something completely different. It's like changing the head coach every 2 years. You never really end up with any kind of, cohesive strategy moving forward. It's like, hey, it didn't move fast enough, therefore we should change it all. Can you just offer a little, maybe kind of 10,000 foot view on, were we trending correctly? Is it better than it was? Like, just give us a little bit on that, if you would.
Well, I think that's a really, multifaceted question. Again, just in terms of the raw numbers, when you look at the number of renters and the number of mortgage holders who are cost burdened, those numbers have increased. I think in large measure, it is a lack of inventory, certainly in terms of single family homes and that starter home price range. We still could afford to put some more rental on the ground. That's kind of hard to believe, but the numbers say we should. But again, when rents are going up twice as fast as incomes, that's just an economic challenge that we all have to experience. So those raw numbers are not trending in the right direction. But I think there's some other challenges. You alluded to the conversations we're having now, what we're experiencing now. 400 years, you don't correct 400 years overnight, and I have come to believe that it is easier to segregate people from opportunity than create opportunity, unfortunately. And we know that there is a profound wealth gap between people of color, particularly Blacks and whites in this country. Richmond's not immune to that, that trend. Just in, I think it was 2017, we run these numbers at the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. We are very cognizant of the Black home ownership rate versus the white home ownership rate in the city of Richmond. And of all the homes purchased in, I think it was 2017, I don't want to give you the number, but it was a very low percentage that were purchased by people of color. And when we first started the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, I was the one who said, look, I don't want to know about our buyers. Don't bring any of that into the boardroom, because I don't want to bring protected classes into the boardroom. But this year, before COVID, we had a strategic plan, and we said, you know what? if we're really about equity, then we got to put a stake in the ground, and we've got to be far more intentional. And we were very intentional about seeking out folks who've not had an opportunity to pursue home ownership. And so we've doubled down on our efforts to reach communities that have been historically marginalized, reach communities where they have not had the financing tools available that there were in other communities. And I'm pleased to say that the Magawal Community Land Trust, our home ownership rate, we have gotten it up to like about 45% people of color. Now we'd like it to be higher, but it takes great intention to change that dynamic. So I think we've got a lot of work to do on the wealth gap, and the wealth gap is tied primarily to home ownership in this country. It just is. We've got to recognize that people have long runways sometimes to home ownership, and I'm not suggesting home ownership is for everyone, but you know, for those who wish to pursue that, if some people may wake up today and they need 18 months to restore credit, to establish credit, to get themselves where they're prepared for that. We need different mechanisms, maybe like rent to own, more of that allow people to move in that direction. The other thing I'll say in terms of trends, Rick, is we have seen significant community development in Richmond. I'm very cautious about using the term revitalization because there were vital communities there. But we've seen a tremendous amount of investment, and let's just take Churchill. And I think we all can agree that investment is a good thing, but we need to recognize that sometimes investment changes the character in terms of the makeup of a community, that people who have called that community home for many, many years, sometimes generations, are sometimes feeling economically displaced or socially displaced. And, you know, it's just one of the things we have to pay attention to. And then again, I think one of the efforts of the Land Trust is go into communities that have seen rapid price appreciation. Some would use the word gentrification, but rapid price appreciation, and try to create permanent affordable housing in those communities, whether it's Carver or Barton Heights or Randolph or Churchill. So people who've lived there forever or many, many years have an opportunity to stay if that's their desire. If there are people who've lived in Randolph or Churchill or Carver and they want to cash out and take advantage of the market, then God bless them, that's their choice. But I just think it's a conversation that we have to have our eyes open to their consequences for different land use policies. And let's think through how policies can disproportionately affect people negatively. And then are there policies that could disproportionately affect people positively? And ought we to be supporting those?